Have you ever wondered what happens when an HOA gets so obsessed with power that they try to control land they don't even own? Well, buckle in, because today's story is going to blow your mind. This is one of the most ridiculous HOA lawsuits I've ever seen, and it ends in a way you won't believe. Before we dive in, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more HOA and Karen revenge stories. And let me know down in the comments, which country are you watching this video from? Now, let's get into it. The property in question was mine, a large stretch of rolling hills just beyond the edge of a wealthy HOA-controlled neighborhood. Their homes were perched neatly on manicured cul-de-sacs, all designed to maintain the same view. The horizon, where my land sat. For years they enjoyed that view, for free, as if it were theirs. But the moment I decided to build a home of my own on my property, they suddenly acted like I was trespassing on their rights. It started quietly at first. I hired a crew, brought in equipment, and began construction of what I had dreamed about for years, a rustic but modern farmhouse overlooking the valley. To me, it was perfect. To the HOA, however, it was the beginning of war. They claimed my house was ruining the character of their community, even though my land was never a part of their jurisdiction. At first, I thought it was just noise. Homeowners sent letters demanding I halt construction. The HOA president, a sharp-tongued woman with a permanent scowl, drove her SUV up to my property line and shouted that my home violated community rules. I laughed it off, thinking logic would prevail. After all, the deed clearly showed I was not and never had been part of their association. But the HOA wasn't going to let it go. When the first walls of my house went up, they escalated. They claimed the structure blocked their million-dollar views. Wealthy residents who'd bought homes on the ridge now stood on their patios, squinting and fuming because they could no longer see every inch of sunset without a sliver of my roof in the way. Soon, I started receiving official-looking notices in the mail. The HOA claimed I was violating their architectural guidelines. They demanded I demolish the partially built house. They threatened fines that added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Every notice ended with the same chilling words: failure to comply will result in legal action. And then they followed through. I'll never forget the day I was served. The envelope was thick, stuffed with page after page of accusations. The HOA had filed a lawsuit claiming I was illegally building within their visual corridor, something they had made up to say that no one could build on land that affected their view. They argued that my house devalued their properties and that I was in violation of their exclusive rights to the land's appearance. It was absurd. My lawyer laughed when he read the first paragraph, but the HOA was dead serious. They gathered residents to complain, filled the courtroom with angry voices, and turned what should have been a simple property dispute into a community spectacle. But here's the thing. I was ready for them. What the HOA didn't know was that I had meticulously documented every step of my ownership. I had permits, surveys, and maps showing that their neighborhood ended well before my land began. I wasn't just prepared to defend myself. I was prepared to expose how far they were willing to twist reality to satisfy their egos. As construction continued, the HOA tried to physically intimidate me. Residents drove golf carts onto my property, blocking construction vehicles. One particularly bold neighbor even planted HOA flags along my boundary line, claiming it was community property. I had to call the sheriff multiple times just to get them off my land. Still, the house went up. By the time the court date rolled around, my farmhouse stood tall, a symbol of defiance and independence. From my porch, I could see the HOA's neat row of houses below, and I knew they were looking back, furious that I hadn't bowed to their demands. The day of court finally arrived, and the HOA president came strutting in like she owned the place. She had binders of evidence, photos of her members' patios, and testimony from homeowners crying about how their views were ruined. They tried to paint me as a selfish landowner who didn't care about the community. But when my lawyer presented our side, the mood shifted. He calmly laid out property lines, zoning documents, and county approvals. The HOA had no authority over me. They had overstepped, and now their arrogance was on full display. The judge listened patiently, but as the HOA droned on about their view rights, his expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief. By the end, it was all he could do not to laugh out loud. And that's exactly what he did. With a smirk, he dismissed their claims, calling them baseless. He said the HOA had no legal standing whatsoever. Their attempt to sue me was not just weak, it was ridiculous. The sound of his gavel striking the desk felt like thunder. The HOA's faces went pale. But this was only the beginning, because while I had won this battle, the HOA wasn't finished fighting. And I wasn't finished showing them just how powerless they really were. The courtroom was still buzzing as the HOA members stormed out. I stood there calm, knowing this was far from over. My land, my home, and my rights had been defended, but the HOA had just been embarrassed in front of a judge, and I knew they wouldn't take that lightly. They were going to come back, harder, angrier, and more desperate. And when they did, I would be ready.
The judge's dismissal should have ended everything. A normal HOA would have licked its wounds, accepted the embarrassment, and moved on. But this was no normal HOA, and its president, Karen, wasn't the type to let go of her grudge. If anything, the courtroom defeat only fueled her obsession with bringing me down. The days following the ruling were oddly quiet. Too quiet. For a brief moment, I thought the nightmare was finally over. My construction crews worked without harassment, and I spent my evenings on the porch of my nearly completed home, watching the sunset over the valley. It felt good, like peace had finally returned. But I should have known better. The HOA wasn't finished. They were plotting. It started with whispers among neighbors. Word spread that the HOA was secretly drafting a new community covenant that expanded their view rights beyond their actual jurisdiction. They wanted to rewrite their rules so that my property, land they didn't own, would fall under their so-called visual preservation zone. It was outrageous, but they were trying anyway. Soon enough, the harassment resumed, and this time it was more aggressive. Anonymous complaints flooded the county office, alleging that my home was unsafe, my permits were forged, or my construction crews were violating noise ordinances. Inspectors were sent out weekly, forced to waste their time on baseless claims. Each inspection ended the same way, with the officials shaking their heads and telling me everything was fine. But the HOA didn't care. Their goal wasn't to win, it was to wear me down. Karen, in particular, seemed to take personal pleasure in tormenting me. She parked her SUV at the edge of my driveway, glaring at me as I worked. Her friends would stand on their patios with binoculars, snapping pictures as if they were gathering evidence. They even created a social media group where they spread lies about me, calling me a reckless developer, destroying their peaceful community. What they didn't know was that I had already started documenting everything. Every photo, every false report, every inspector's finding that cleared me. I kept it all neatly organized. If they wanted to drag me back into court, I'd be ready to humiliate them again. Still, their campaign took its toll. My construction slowed because of constant interruptions. Deliveries were delayed after HOA members called trucking companies to warn them about dealing with me. Some subcontractors even quit, tired of the harassment. It was clear the HOA wanted to make building my dream home as difficult as possible. But the worst came one afternoon when I returned home to find survey stakes pulled from the ground. The HOA had trespassed onto my property and planted their own markers, claiming to redefine the boundary line. They were so desperate they had literally tried to redraw the map to include my house within their domain. That was the last straw. I called the sheriff immediately, and though the deputies were sympathetic, they explained that property disputes often fell into civil territory. It was frustrating, but I wasn't discouraged. If the HOA wanted another fight, they were going to get one. Only this time, I'd make sure the entire community knew exactly what kind of corruption their board was involved in. The timing couldn't have been better. The HOA had scheduled a public meeting to present their new covenant. They planned to rally the neighborhood, push through the bogus expansion, and tighten their grip. But what they didn't expect was me showing up with proof of their harassment, trespassing, and intimidation. When the night of the meeting arrived, the clubhouse was packed. Dozens of homeowners filled the seats, murmuring with anticipation. Karen stood at the front, smug as ever, with her stack of papers. She began her speech about preserving community harmony and protecting property values. Her supporters nodded along while others shifted uncomfortably, sensing something wasn't right. And then it was my turn. I stood before the crowd, calm and steady, and began laying out the facts. I showed the judge's ruling dismissing their lawsuit. I displayed photographs of HOA members trespassing on my land. I revealed the false complaints filed with the county, each one stamped unfounded. I even pulled up boundary maps highlighting how their new covenant blatantly attempted to seize property that didn't belong to them. Gasps rippled through the room. Homeowners turned to each other whispering. Some of them had no idea their board was going this far. They had been told half-truths, manipulated into thinking I was a threat. Now they were seeing the truth with their own eyes. Karen's face flushed red as I spoke. She tried to interrupt, but the murmurs of dissent grew louder. Neighbors who had once supported her were now demanding answers. The board members shifted uncomfortably, realizing the tide was turning against them. By the end of the meeting, the room was in chaos. Some residents shouted at Karen to step down. Others demanded the board withdraw the covenant immediately. Karen, cornered and desperate, tried to defend herself, but her words fell flat. The damage was done. The community had seen her for what she really was, a bully who abused her position to pursue a personal vendetta. The meeting ended in disaster for the HOA. The covenant proposal was tabled indefinitely. Neighbors who had once harassed me began apologizing, admitting they had been misled. For the first time, the HOA's iron grip on the neighborhood was starting to crack. But even then, Karen wasn't finished. Her pride wouldn't let her back down. And as I would soon find out, she was preparing one final move, a desperate gamble that would either destroy me or destroy her completely.
Karen's pride couldn't survive humiliation. After the disastrous HOA meeting, most people would have cut their losses, resigned, and slipped quietly into obscurity. But Karen wasn't built that way. Her obsession with controlling the neighborhood and with destroying me consumed her completely. She had one last card to play, and she was reckless enough to use it. Just 2 weeks after the failed covenant proposal, I received notice of yet another lawsuit. This time, the HOA accused me of willfully obstructing scenic rights, a laughable term they invented by twisting outdated zoning language. According to their filing, my house had been intentionally designed to block the collective enjoyment of nature, and therefore, the HOA was entitled to damages. It was absurd on every level, but it forced us back into court. My lawyer smirked as he read through the complaint, saying he had seen petty cases before, but this one was in a league of its own. It was clear Karen wasn't just after control anymore, she wanted revenge. The trial drew massive attention. Local media picked up the story, fascinated by the idea of an HOA suing someone for blocking a view. Headlines mocked the case, calling it the pettiest lawsuit of the year. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, and neighbors whispered about how far Karen had fallen. When the day arrived, the courtroom was packed. Karen strutted in, clutching her stack of papers, surrounded by a dwindling group of loyal supporters. She wore the smug look of someone who still believed she had power, but the cracks were showing. The HOA's attorney argued passionately, waving photographs of my house and claiming it had ruined the skyline. He painted dramatic pictures of neighbors reduced to misery because they could no longer sip coffee while gazing at the horizon.
He even tried to argue that the mental anguish caused by my home should result in financial compensation for the entire HOA board. The judge listened patiently, nodding occasionally, but his expression never changed. When it was our turn, my lawyer stood calmly, unfolded a single map, and began dismantling their argument piece by piece. First, he pointed out the obvious. My property was not within the HOA's jurisdiction. Their authority ended at the boundary line, and my house stood firmly outside it. Second, he showed the permits, every one of them, approved, signed, and sealed by the county. My construction had been legal from the start. Third, he highlighted precedent. No law in the state recognized a right to a view. Property rights extended to land, not landscapes. If such a claim were valid, every tree, fence, or new building could be sued for existing. Finally, he turned to the judge, holding up their own photographs, and pointed out something none of them had noticed. The so-called obstructed view they kept referring to wasn't obstructed at all. The horizon remained perfectly visible, just slightly shifted. Their entire case was based on exaggeration and spite. The courtroom erupted in muffled laughter. Even the bailiff covered his mouth to hide a grin. The HOA's argument collapsed right there. When the judge finally spoke, his words cut sharper than any lawyer's. He called the lawsuit frivolous, vindictive, and a gross misuse of judicial resources. He reminded Karen and her board that the legal system was not a playground for personal vendettas. Then, in a move that sealed their fate, he ordered the HOA to pay not only my legal fees, but also a hefty fine for wasting the court's time. Karen's face drained of color. Her supporters shifted uncomfortably, realizing their loyalty had led them into disaster. By the time the gavel fell, the HOA wasn't just humiliated, it was financially crippled. News outlets had a field day. Stories ran about the HOA that sued for a view and got laughed out of court. The ruling spread across social media, with people everywhere mocking Karen's arrogance. My neighbors, once hostile, now treated me with respect. Some even confessed they had been afraid to stand up to Karen until they saw me fight back. Within weeks, Karen resigned in disgrace. The HOA board crumbled, replaced by new leadership determined to rebuild trust and undo the damage she had caused. For the first time, the neighborhood began to feel like a community again, not a dictatorship. As for me, I finally finished my home. I moved in, standing on my porch with the valley stretching out below me, and felt the weight of the ordeal lift from my shoulders. It hadn't been easy. The harassment, the lies, the endless court battles. But in the end, the truth prevailed. Karen thought she could control me with fear, but instead she exposed herself as the very thing she accused others of being: selfish, petty, and destructive. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. She had tried to destroy me for blocking her view, but all she had really done was block her own future. And as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson, I couldn't help but laugh. After everything, the view was still mine.